The ancient witness today is from Ruth 2, verses 1 through 23. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I might favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The young man who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers.' So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting for even a moment." Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, how you left your mother and father and your native land and came to people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Then she said, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of this bread and dip your morsel into the sour wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and came into town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Then she took out and gave her what was left over after she herself had been satisfied. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, saying, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, otherwise someone might bother you in another field." And so she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
Thank you, Susan. You know, in the Bible, we often forget that so much of the ancient texts are stories, they're narratives, and so it's really good to approach it that way, and we can hear the stories. And so what we're doing now is we're going through the whole story of Ruth. It's a small little book in the Hebrew Scriptures, and so we're going to be doing this until the four chapters. There's only 4 chapters in Ruth, and so we're going to go through all the chapters on successive Sundays. And so I think it's really a fun thing to do. I think it's important to occasionally remind ourselves that that this is the structure of the ancient text. And so last week, one of the things that we noticed about the first chapter in Ruth is this idea of hesed, or loyalty, often translated as kindness or steadfast love. Hesed is about binding oneself to another and clinging to the other, stubbornly holding on. And we see this when it talks about how Ruth and Naomi clung together as a couple. And so this dogged determination is a quality that we also see in God. I think that's one of the things that the author of this story is trying to convey to us, this notion of what is sacred, what is divine, and they hold up this idea of hesed. And so hesed is something that all people of faith are required to participate in. And so I'll remind you what the story went. So you had Naomi, and Naomi was married to Elimelech, and they had two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And so there was a big famine, and so this whole family goes into Moab. And like many immigrants, they cross these borders in order to escape crushing poverty and hunger. And so when they were in Moab, Elimelech dies. And so the two, Naomi's two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they get married, and they marry two Moabite women because they're in Moab. And so the two Moabite women are Ruth and Orpah. And then what happens is that the two sons die, Mahlon and Chilion die. And so all that's left now are Naomi and then the two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. And so they decide to go back. They go back to Judah because they are without any kind of support. All the family support is lost to them. And so they're working their way back, and Naomi says, to Ruth and Orpah, you might as well just leave. I'm a lost cause. You might as well just go back to Moab, to your families. You'll have a lot more luck there, and you'll be able to find more support. And Orpah does that, but Ruth, it says, clung to Naomi and stuck with her. And so that's where we are now. Ruth and Naomi are back in Judah, and they're living together and supporting each other. And so what we see in Ruth is this incredible devotion to Naomi, who viewed herself as a lost cause, her mother-in-law. And she demonstrates what the writer refers to as hesed, loyalty, devotion to Naomi. And so today now we're reading another part of the story where Ruth goes out, and they're poor. They don't have any means of support, and so they're poor. And so Ruth goes out into the field and gleans in the fields behind the harvester. So first what is gleaning? What is this weird word? Well, in Israelite law, they made provision for the poor to provide for themselves, to pick up all of the leftover grain in the harvest. And they do this by hand. And much of this would have been wasted anyway. And this was to ensure that there would be something for the poor to eat, and the law required the farmers actually to leave part of the harvest for gleaning by the poor. In Leviticus, it says this: when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them to the poor and the alien. See, and that's who Ruth was. Ruth was poor and an alien, an immigrant. I remember when I was in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It was right after I graduated from college, and I went to work at a halfway house. And they had this organization there called the Gleaners. It was kind of a modern day version of this. And so what they did is that they would get all this food that was left over from grocery stores and from warehouses and from restaurants. A lot of this food was perfectly good to eat, but a lot of it was past the expiration date, but it was surplus food. And they put it in this warehouse, and they made it available to people in Grand Rapids. And I was part of this halfway house, and they let us go there to provide for some of the people who were residents of this halfway house. And I read somewhere, I think about a year ago, where France actually made it illegal for grocery stores to throw away excess food, and they needed to make it available. See, very, very reminiscent of ancient Israelite law, actually. See, wouldn't it be nice here if we made it illegal in this country? So, it says that Ruth was gleaning, and it says, as it happened, or as luck would have it, they were in the very same field owned by a relative of whom Naomi had spoken. And the name of this relative was Boaz. And as it happens, Boaz noticed Ruth and heard Ruth's story, and we have the conversation that follows. And what happened is that Boaz learned of Ruth's kindness and devotion and loyalty toward Naomi. And so then the question comes, to whom does this young woman belong? Now notice the patriarchal culture here. A young woman must belong to somebody. She's not, she's a possession, not a person, right? Boaz does not ask her name, but rather the name of her owner. So the question fits the culture, but not the woman. And the servant cannot answer in the traditional way. And so when Boaz hears Ruth's story, he gives her permission to glean in his field, and he encourages her to help herself when she is thirsty, and tells his servants not to harass her. Apparently, it was rather common for the young male workers to take advantage of the poor young females who were vulnerable. And so Boaz says to them, look, leave her alone. And he says to Ruth, stay in my fields close to my women, and you're going to be okay. You'll be all right. Now, when Ruth hears all this, she's, overwhelmed. And so it says she falls prostrate on the ground. This is a posture of worship in the ancient world. And she says, why have I found favor in your sight? I don't understand this. Me, I'm a foreigner. And so Boaz then responds to her by heaping praise on her and saying, and he says, first, he wishes God's blessing upon her for the kindness and the loyalty toward Naomi, for her hesed. Then he gives her even more that she can eat at mealtime, and finally he commands his workers to leave something extra for her. And then she goes home now, dragging this hefty load of grain. An ephah is about 30 to 50 pounds, so it's a lot of grain. And so when Ruth arrives home, she shows Naomi her load, and Naomi says, this is amazing. Blessed be the one who took notice of you. Where have you worked? And so then Ruth tells her where. Naomi says, this is incredible. This is a coincidence. Boaz is one of our nearest kin, actually. Another translation reads, he is one of our redeemers. Now, why is that important? And why would they use that name? Well, under Israelite law, the next of kin had an obligation to protect the honor and the property of his family, his extended family. And so when we think that we have grown as a civilization, we're more ethically and morally evolved, we should look back upon this time when it was actually illegal not to care for our relatives. And if one of those abandoned on the streets and nursing homes, there would be many people who would be brought to trial under Israelite law. It says, if any of your kin falls into difficulty and sells a piece of property, the next of kin shall come and redeem or buy it back what the relative has sold. This is why they called their nearest kin their redeemer. And this is why it was so important to Naomi, because the redeemer is the male relative who upholds the rights of the family members. Now, at this point in the story, it doesn't seem that Boaz is aware of this fact, actually. Otherwise, if he knows of the relationship and responsibilities, then the kind words and the generous actions actually would not go far enough. It is also interesting that Naomi has not sought his help at this point, even though she knew who he was. Maybe she thought he was still too distant and not close enough. Now, whatever the case, this part of the story ends almost as it had begun, in uncertainty. It ends by saying that Ruth gleaned until the end of the harvest, all the time living with her mother-in-law, Naomi, all the time not saying a word to Boaz about being their redeemer. So through kindness, she was able to eat and live for a couple more months. But now the harvest is over. And now what? What's going to happen? So, the setting is still rather overcast and gloomy for Naomi and Ruth. There's still dark clouds overhead. Underneath Ruth's polite words is a woman who has no one to notice her, and if no one does, she will certainly die. In this story, Ruth is someone who must rely upon the goodwill or the grace or the hesed of those around her. And even though a lot has happened, this doesn't change. And yet, this is how God has created us all to live. That we must rely upon the goodwill and the grace and the kindness. That we must have it or we'll die. That we can never grow so independent, so successful, so self-reliant that we do not need love or we do not need hesed. Life is sustained by kindness. This is one of the themes of the story. Human beings cannot live without the grace and the kindness which comes from God. We are dependent. And so part of what's going on here is God is inviting us to live in this way of life. So you see, according to the prophet Jeremiah, we read God saying this, I act with steadfast love, or the word here is hesed. I act with hesed, justice and righteousness. For in these things I delight, says the Lord. And so God delights in this way of life. God delights in hesed, in loyalty, where we bind ourselves to each other the way Ruth bound herself to Naomi, and now in the way that Boaz has bound himself to Ruth. That God blesses this. And so this is Ruth's experience. She says, why have I found favor in your sight? It's because of her own kindness and faithfulness that she experiences Boaz's kindness as an affirmation and as a validation from God. Boaz, a person of privilege and wealth, shows hesed and loyalty and kindness to Ruth. Ruth, who is poor and vulnerable and marginalized. And Naomi says, "Blessed be he by the Holy One, whose kindness has not forsaken the living and the dead." We read this and we say, whose kindness, whose hesed is she talking about? Is she talking about God's kindness or Boaz's kindness? And the answer, of course, is yes. We see God's kindness working through others. We see God's hesed working through Ruth and through Boaz. For through Ruth, the pattern of kindness is set in motion. And we see that kindness begets kindness. Kindness begets community. We see that true life depends upon people working kindness to one another. This is the kind of living in which God delights, says the Scriptures. To live in reciprocal kindness and mutual loyalty with others, especially the poor, especially the vulnerable. And then when we do this, we find favor. We are blessed by God. Paul wrote, "Let us not grow weary in doing what is right, for we will reap at the harvest time." By doing what is right. And so, friends, let us know that the Holy One is always loyal and faithful to us in all of our trials and tribulations and our struggles and daily living. We know that the Holy One clings to us, will not let us go, and is eternally loyal. This is God's hesed. Even when we are not loving or loyal ourselves, God is loving and steadfast. And because we experience this, we can show the same kind of loyalty, the same kind of determination, the same kind of stubborn love for each other and all people. And for all who are pushed around by the world or by the church, or by those in power, those who use the power to silence others and intimidate. And so we cling together here. We bind ourselves together through thick and thin, through good times and bad. And we unite our privilege with the lowliness of others, our abundance with those who have need. Now, of course, people are human. They make mistakes. There's nothing in our story to suggest that Ruth and Naomi were perfect people. It's possible they each had qualities that drove each other crazy, but they held on to each other. And we will not let disappointments entice us to give up on each other either. And so may this be a community marked by hesed. May the message of God's steadfast love shine through us as it shined through Ruth and Boaz. And as we do this, the Holy One will smile and rejoice, and God's face will shine upon us and look upon us with favor. Amen.